The Syrian civil war, a conflict that has become synonymous with unimaginable suffering and geopolitical complexity, began in the spring of 2011 amidst a wave of popular uprisings across the Arab world. Inspired by the successes of the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions, ordinary Syrians, yearning for freedom and democratic representation, took to the streets demanding political reforms and an end to decades of authoritarian rule under the Assad regime. The Syrian government, led by President Bashar al-Assad, responded to these peaceful demonstrations with brutal force. Security forces opened fire on unarmed protesters, arbitrarily detained activists and suspected dissidents, and unleashed a campaign of terror that shocked the world. The regime's violent crackdown, far from quelling the protests, only served to further inflame the situation, driving more and more Syrians to take up arms against their government. As the situation spiraled into armed conflict, what began as a peaceful movement for democratic change transformed into a complex and multifaceted civil war. Deep-seated sectarian divisions, simmering beneath the surface of Syrian society, were exacerbated by the violence, pitting different ethnic and religious groups against each other. The country descended into chaos, with government forces, armed rebel groups, and a multitude of other actors vying for control of territory and resources. The Syrian civil war quickly evolved into a proxy war, with regional and international powers intervening in the conflict to advance their own strategic interests. Russia and Iran emerged as staunch allies of the Assad regime, providing military and financial support to bolster the Syrian government's flagging forces. Russia, eager to maintain its influence in the Middle East and protect its naval base in the Syrian port of Tartus, launched a devastating air campaign in support of Assad in 2015, significantly altering the course of the war. On the other side of the conflict, a loose coalition of Western and regional powers, including the United States, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, provided varying degrees of support to armed opposition groups fighting against the Assad regime. However, these countries' support for the Syrian opposition was often inconsistent and driven by competing agendas, ultimately hindering the effectiveness of the anti-Assad forces. The conflict was further complicated by the emergence of extremist groups, such as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, which exploited the chaos and instability to seize control of vast swaths of territory in both Syria and neighboring Iraq. ISIS's brutal tactics, including mass killings, sexual enslavement, and the destruction of cultural heritage sites, horrified the world and drew international attention to the Syrian conflict. The Syrian civil war has had a devastating impact on the country and its people. Years of relentless fighting have reduced once vibrant cities to rubble, destroyed infrastructure, and displaced millions of Syrians from their homes. The United Nations estimates that over 500,000 people have been killed in the conflict, with countless others injured or traumatized by the violence. The conflict has triggered a humanitarian catastrophe of immense proportions. Millions of Syrians have been internally displaced, seeking refuge in overcrowded camps or makeshift shelters, while millions more have fled across borders, becoming refugees in neighboring countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. The sheer scale of the humanitarian crisis has overwhelmed aid organizations, leaving many Syrians without access to basic necessities like food, water, shelter, and medical care. Moreover, the conflict has created a breeding ground for extremism. The rise of ISIS and other jihadist groups is a direct consequence of the chaos and instability that has engulfed Syria. The Syrian war has attracted foreign fighters from around the world, drawn to the conflict by a toxic mix of ideology, adventure-seeking, and the promise of a so-called caliphate established by ISIS. In the waning days of 2024, after more than a decade of brutal civil war, the Assad regime finally crumbled. Weakened by years of fighting, international sanctions, and a resurgent rebel offensive, Bashar al-Assad fled Damascus for Russia, leaving behind a country shattered by conflict and on the brink of a new era. While the fall of Assad marks a turning point in the Syrian conflict, it is far from the end of the crisis. Syria remains a deeply divided and fragmented country. The northwest remains under the control of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, a powerful Islamist group that has consolidated its grip on Idlib province and parts of Aleppo. The northeast is largely controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, a Kurdish-led militia with ties to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, in Turkey. The future of Syria remains uncertain. The international community, long divided over how to address the Syrian crisis, faces the daunting task of rebuilding a shattered nation and fostering a lasting peace. The challenges are immense, ranging from addressing the humanitarian needs of millions of displaced Syrians to dismantling the remnants of extremist groups like ISIS.